G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Well, welcome to this session of the life of Messiah. We're looking at the crucifixion and death of the King. In the last session, we saw the second trial before Pilate, and there was a second attempt to release Jesus. Pilate gave the Jews a choice between Barabbas and Jesus. Barabbas was actually guilty of the crime for which Jesus was being accused, which was sedition. And we learned that Barabbas's real name was Jesus, son of the Father. Bar means son, Abbas, father. Pilate scourges Jesus in an attempt to have him released, but to no avail. The chief priest cry out for his crucifixion. Pilate is intimidated by being accused of not being a friend of Caesar, and Pilate then sits in the judgment seat and the Bema seat, and he sits there to pass judgment. And he has one last final attempt to have Jesus released, but that fails. And he says, "Behold your king." The Jews then declare that they have no king but Caesar, and that Jesus's blood will be upon them and their children. And that did come to pass 40 years later. Pilate issues a death sentence, and Jesus is now prepared for crucifixion. Because of his weakened state, because of the scourging, one Simon of Cyrene is pressed into carrying his cross for him. And at the very time, 9 a.m. in the morning, that's the time that the Passover sacrifice is being offered on the Temple Mount, Jesus is nailed to the cross. On the cross, he prays for forgiveness for those who crucified him in ignorance. Now, in fulfillment of prophecy, his garments are parted among the soldiers, and he's crucified among two transgressors. Above his head, Pilate places the superscription, "The King of the Jews." In the first 3 hours, we see the wrath of men on the cross. We see also that he was mocked 4 times before his crucifixion, and now he is mocked while on the cross for the 5th time by passerbys or passers-by, on the 6th time by the Jewish leaders, and the 7th time by the Roman soldiers. And now we come to the 8th mockery. And this time we see this in Matthew 27, verse 44. And the robbers, or the rebels, also that were crucified with him, cast upon him the same reproach. So the 8th mockery was committed by the two men crucified with Jesus. And initially, both of them participated in ridiculing him. So Jesus was suffering mockery from 4 groups. But there was a common element present in all of them. All 4 groups mock specific messianic claims that Jesus made. All 4 groups challenge him to prove his messiahship by coming down from the cross. And that's the very thing that Satan wanted him to do. This is Satan's last-ditch attempt to derail the atonement. Think about it. By staying on the cross, Jesus proved his messiahship. If Jesus had died at any other time or in any other way, no atonement would have been made. And if he'd used his messianic power to free himself, he would have proven to be a false Messiah. Because crucifixion was how the Messiah was supposed to die. Now, we see the conversion of one of these malefactors, one of these rebels. And this is stage 15. Now, this appears in Luke 23, verses 39 to 42. And one of the malefactors that were hanged railed on him, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, and rebuking him, said, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing amiss." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." So we do not have a lot of good words, a lot of words from the good thief, well, I'll say good thief, or the rebel, but his theology was rather clear. He had grasped 4 points of theology. First of all, he knew that he was a sinner, and sinners need saviors. Second, he knew that Christ was sinless, because he says this man has done nothing amiss. And third, even though Christ was dying the same kind of death, he knew that Christ could save him. And this showed that he believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And the fourth thing, he knew that Christ would come into his kingdom. He saw him dying, but he knew he would come into his kingdom. Now, these are all the basic elements of salvation and faith. So this man, this malefactor, this rebel, despite a life full of sin, comes to Jesus and seeks forgiveness in his last mortal moments. And he confesses his guilt and casts himself on Jesus's mercy and saving power. And this is a fantastic picture of God's grace. Now in Luke 23:43, we see the second statement from the cross. So the good thief, I call him the good thief, the one who came to faith, his request: Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now this led to a reply from Jesus, and we see this in verse 43 of Luke 23. And he said unto him, verily I say unto you, today shall you be with me in paradise. The truths of Jesus's words in this verse would prove that he was the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus told the criminal that he would not have to wait until the kingdom to be remembered. He would be remembered that same day when he died. He would go down to the place known as paradise or Abraham's bosom. We learned that earlier in the course, and that this is a compartment of Hades, which was where, or Hades or hell, which was where believers went before Jesus's ascension to heaven. So at this stage, he would die and he would go into paradise or Abraham's bosom in Sheol. We now see the third statement from the cross in John chapter 19, verses 25 to 27. But there were standing by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Miriam, the wife of Cleopas, and Miriam Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, he said unto his mother, woman, behold your son. Then said he to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her onto his own home. Now, if we compare John's account with Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and Matthew chapter 27, verse 56, we can see that there are 4 women's names mentioned. The most prominent one was Jesus' mother, Mary, or Miriam. The second woman was also named Miriam, and she's referred to as the mother of James and Judas, 2 of Jesus's disciples. Now, she was the wife of Cleopas, which John verse 25 tells us. Now, he was one of the disciples on the Emmaus Road. The third woman was named Salome, and she was the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, 2 other members of the apostolic group. She was also the sister of Jesus's mother, and that would make her his aunt. And James and John would be his first cousins. The fourth woman was Mary Magdalene, and among these women stood John, the only one to record this incident. Now, Mary, his mother, she came along with John, the disciple, and she stood before the cross. And what she saw happening to her son was a fulfillment of the prophecy which Simeon had made in the temple when Jesus was 40 days old, right back in paragraph 13. This was that the sword which would pierce her own soul. The words from the cross which Jesus spoke to his mother we see in John 19, 26 to 27. "Woman, behold your son." Now, he was not referring to himself there, he was referring to John. And then he spoke to John and saying, "Behold your mother." Now, it was the Jewish expectation that one of the functions of a firstborn son is to take care of the welfare of his mother. And this Jesus did by placing his mother into the care of the Apostle John. Remember, at this time, his own brothers were not believers. So he chose John to take care of his mother instead of one of them. So Mary and John now belong to each other in the legal position of mother and son. John was to take care of Mary because it says he took her onto his own home in John 19, verse 27. Now, with this, the first 3 hours on the cross in which Jesus suffered the wrath of men now ends. We now come to the 3 hours of darkness on the cross. And we see this in Matthew 24, 45 to 50, Mark 15, 33 to 37, Luke 23, 44 to 46, and we'll look at John 19, 28 to 30. Now, in the first 3 hours on the cross, Jesus suffered the wrath of men. And in the second 3 hours, Jesus suffered the wrath of God. Jesus partook of the cup and suffered the wrath of God. Now, it was Friday. It was from noon, from 12 o'clock until 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The wrath of God covers the 18th through the 25th stages of this passion narrative that we're doing. In Luke 23, 44 to 45, we read, "And it was now about the 6th hour, and a darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, the sun's light failing." So here we're going to see the darkness of the 18th stage, darkness over the whole inhabited world. These 3 hours of darkness mark the 3 hours of Jesus's spiritual death. Remember the cup which Jesus prayed he wouldn't have to drink, but he said he would drink it if it were the Father's will. That was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was now going to drink that. So Jesus was spiritually dead. He was spiritually separated from the Father in his humanity, not his deity, which remains eternal and unchangeable. And he's separated for this period of 3 hours, where he suffered the wrath of God against sin. Now, this was not necessary for the atonement. According to the scriptures, all that was necessary for the atonement was the shedding of blood. Now, God wanted more at this point. He wanted his son to suffer his full wrath against sin. Now, through archaeology, we have found other sources that speak of the same darkness from noon until 3 p.m. And the dating is from this actual period. One such source is a writer called Dionysius, a Greek scientist. He reports that he saw this phenomenon while he was in Heliopolis in Egypt. And the irony here is that Heliopolis means the city of the sun, but the city of the sun was actually blacked out. The second writer was a man called Diogenes, also a Greek scientist in Egypt. He wrote a very interesting statement, which is worth mentioning. He said that he saw a solar darkness of such like that either the deity himself had suffered at that moment or was sympathizing with someone who had. And there was a bit of spiritual insight there. The deity, God the Son, suffered in that darkness, and God the Father and God the Spirit sympathized with him as he suffered. Another writer, a guy called Phlegon, Phlegon, of Tralles, a Greek from Asia Minor, he wrote that he was a statesman of the Emperor Hadrian, and that in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, which is roughly equivalent to AD 30, there was a great and remarkable eclipse of the sun above any that had happened before. He says at the 6th hour, which is noon, the day was turned into the darkness of night so that the stars were seen in heaven, and that there was a great earthquake in the Roman province of Bithynia, which overthrew many houses in Nicaea, which is northwest Turkey. So that's where he was up there. So Phlegon called it an eclipse, but it could not be an eclipse as we know it, because during an eclipse, stars do not become visible. But he said he saw stars. So this was a very unique darkness, and there's a record of this darkness in various parts of the Greek world. Now we see the 19th stage, where we see the fourth statement from the cross, and Matthew 27 verse 46. At the end of the 3 hours of darkness, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Matthew 27:46 says, and about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, Jesus was quoting Psalm 22, verse 1, which along with Isaiah 53 contains the most detailed prophecy of Messiah's death. Now, if we were to take this statement in isolation, one might think that this was a cry of despair and defeat. However, in the context of Psalm 22, Jesus actually cried for help at the end of the 3 hours of his suffering, the wrath of God. Jesus' cry for help was answered later, which we'll see in stage 24. Jesus died spiritually and was resurrected spiritually before finally dying physically on that cross. Remember, spiritual death is separation from God. Jesus was made spiritually alive, no longer separated spiritually from the Father again, prior to his physical death. Spiritual death is separation from God. His human spirit was separated from God the Father as he became the sin offering for us. Now, what is important to note here is that Jesus addressed his Father as my God, my God. This was the only time in the life of Jesus that we know of that he addressed the Father by the words, my God. In the Gospels, 170 times Jesus called God Father, and 21 times he called God my Father. So for 191 times the word Father was used, but it was never God, except for this once. So why was this the only time that Jesus addressed God as God? Because with the sins of the world now placed upon the Son, there was no longer a paternal relationship. There was no longer a father-son relationship. It was now a judicial relationship. Being a judicial relationship because Jesus was now suffering the wrath of God for sin. And therefore, he did not use the title Avi, Avi, my Father, but instead, Eli, Eli, my God, my God. Stage 20, we now see the reaction of the bystanders. In Matthew 27, verses 47 to 49. And some of them that stood there, when they heard it, said, this man calls Elijah. And straightway one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. And the rest said, let be. Let us see whether Elijah comes to save him. So in these verses, we see that someone thought Jesus was getting delirious and tried to offer him a drink. And those around stopped him from doing this, saying, let us see if Elijah will come. They had misunderstood his cry of Eli, Eli, as being a cry for Elijah the prophet. Now, Eli is also short for Elijah in Hebrew, and they were waiting to see if Elijah would come to rescue him. And then in stage 21, we have the fifth word from the cross. After this, Jesus, knowing, this is in John 19:28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things are now finished, that the scripture might be accomplished, said, I thirst. Now, I thirst is a significant word. Cast your mind back to Luke chapter 16, verses 22 to 24. In that account, we had a rich man, and this rich man was in hell after suffering the wrath of God and the torments of hell, he said how thirsty he was, and he cried in anguish to Father Abraham across the chasm. He said, "Dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame." So for 3 hours, Jesus had suffered the wrath of God, and at the end of such suffering, he cried, "I thirst." Stage 22, we have the drinking of vinegar found in John 19, verse 29. There was set there a vessel full of vinegar. So they put a sponge full of the vinegar upon hyssop and brought it to his mouth. Now Jesus partook of this vinegar or sour wine because it was not the same stupefying mixture which induced lightheadedness, which he had refused earlier. This one moistened his mouth, his lips, and his tongue, so that the last two statements Jesus made from the cross, by far the two of the most important of the 7 statements, could be heard clearly and distinctly. Now we have the statement from the cross, which is a 23rd stage in John 19, verse 30. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." The expression "it is finished," tetelestai in the Greek translation, was used in the area of accounting, and spelled out across invoices was over and over again one word, tetelestai, meaning this invoice was paid in full. Now, all other animal sacrifices of the past were only installments. This is the final installment. This is the final payment for sin, the death of Jesus. What all this means is that the debt for sin was now paid in full. If we were to look into Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 to 14, Paul, writing to them, says, "When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having cancelled out the certificate of death consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross." Tetelestai, paid in full. Stage 24, we now have the 7th statement from the cross. And this is in the Luke account, Luke 23, verse 46, which records the last words of Jesus. And Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." In this 7th statement, Jesus emphasized the voluntary character of his death when he said, "I commend or dismiss my spirit." Jesus is the one who chose the moment of his death and dismissed his spirit from his body. Jesus now once again addressed God as Father, showing that his cry for help in the 19th stage was answered, and the father-son relationship was now restored. So Jesus died spiritually, he was separated from God, and he was resurrected spiritually before he actually died physically. Now, this 7th statement, and remember, that is in his humanity. This 7th statement is based on Psalm 31, verse 5, which says, "Into your hand I commend my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Jehovah, you God of truth." Stage 25, we see the death of Jesus. We see this in Matthew 27:50, Mark 15:37, and Luke 23, verse 46. Jesus' physical death now followed. Mark and Luke noted that he gave up the ghost. That's Mark 15:37 and Luke 23:46. Matthew stated that he yielded up his spirit. That's Matthew 27, verse 50. The voluntary character was further seen because a man first dies and then his head falls. However, in John's gospel, Jesus first bowed his head and then he dismissed his spirit from his body. It says, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And that is simply showing us that his death was voluntary. He was in total control. Now, the death of Jesus is the first of the 3 points of the gospel message, that Messiah died for our sins. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3. His death specifically accomplished the atonement, which is why the New Testament writers developed in detail the theological implications and significance of his death. And there are 15 such results. The first result of his death is satisfaction. By his death, Jesus accomplished satisfaction. Now, theologically speaking, satisfaction means a full legal equivalent for wrong done. The point is that the law, which was the law of Moses, has been satisfied for what it demanded concerning the wrong done. Jesus' death answered all the demands of God's law and justice against the sinner. The law no longer condemns the sinner who believes in Jesus. For such, there can now be no condemnation. And you can see that in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. The law, according to Leviticus 17:11, required satisfaction. And with his death, the justice of God was now satisfied. There was a satisfaction of divine law. It was predicted that Jesus would satisfy the demands of the law. We see that in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 10 to 12. Isaiah 53, 10 to 12. And this is exactly what Jesus did by his death. And we find this in Romans 3, verses 3 to 4, Galatians 1, 4, and Ephesians 5, 2. It's there on the screen. So Jesus' death is a satisfaction of what the penalty of the law demanded. Second, redemption. Now, redemption means that Jesus' death paid the price of the penalty of sin. And we get this definition from the way 7 Greek words are used in the New Testament. And when we combine the meanings of these 7 Greek words, the New Testament concept of redemption is that believers have been purchased out of the slave market of sin and are now set free. And you can find this in Galatians 3:13, Galatians 3:13, and 1 Timothy 2:6. 1 Timothy 2:6. Believers have been redeemed in 5 specific areas. For those who are Jewish believers, they have been redeemed from the penalty of the law, and that's Galatians 3:13. Second, Jewish believers are also redeemed from the law itself, Mosaic law. They are no longer obligated to keep the 613 commandments of the law of Moses. And you find that in Romans 6:14, and Galatians 4:4 to 5. All believers today are obligated to keep the law of Messiah, not in order to be saved, but to be sanctified, to be set apart. Now, the third area of redemption here, all believers, both Jews and Gentiles, have now been redeemed from the power of sin. And we see that in Romans 5, verse 18 and 19, Romans 5, 18 and 19, Romans 6, 6 and 14, Romans 6, 6 and 14. The fourth area, there's also been redemption, there's been a redemption from the power of Satan. Why? Because a believer is no longer obligated to obey Satan. And you can find this in Colossians 1:13, Colossians 1:13, and Hebrews 2:14 to 15, Hebrews 2:14 to 15. The fifth thing is believers are now guaranteed a future final redemption from all evil, which will occur with the resurrection of the body. And we find this in Luke 21, verse 28, Romans 8 verse 23, and Ephesians 1:14 and Ephesians 4:30. The third result is propitiation. Propitiation means that God is satisfied with what the death of Messiah accomplished. And we can find this in 1 John 2 verse 2. 1 John 2:2. Now, in its very basic meaning, to propitiate means to appease. To appease. Messiah's sacrifice appeased the wrath of God, which was revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And that's what Romans 1:18 says. So Romans 1:18. God's wrath has now been appeased by the death of Jesus, because now God is satisfied with what his son's death accomplished. Now, propitiation does not mean Messiah's death merely satisfied a vengeful God. Rather, it satisfied a God who is just, who is righteous, and who is holy. The same God who demands satisfaction also shows his mercy in that he sent his son to be a propitiation. Fourth result is reconciliation. Now, reconciliation means to change the relationship of one person to another person, to change from enmity to friendship. So the position of the world was changed by the death of Jesus, so that all men are now able to be saved, and his death rendered the whole world savable. Now, this does not mean that the whole world will be saved, because salvation is only applied to those who believe. So while on the one hand, God is said to be propitiated, on the other hand, man is said to be reconciled. If we look at what biblical reconciliation is, to explain it, it means that when God originally created man and God were face to face. They were face to face in fellowship. But when man sinned, he turned his back on God, and as a result, God turned his back on man. And then came the death of Jesus, by which God was now propitiated, law was now satisfied, and God has now turned again to face man with outstretched arms. And it's now the responsibility of each individual person to turn and face God by accepting the substitution that he has provided in Jesus. Romans 5:10, a couple of passages here which teach on reconciliation. Romans 5:10 teaches that men were reconciled back to God while they were his enemies. That's Romans 5:10. And Colossians 1:20 states that God reconciled all things unto himself through the death of Jesus. And then you see 2 Corinthians 5:19 states that God was in Messiah, God was in Christ, reconciling the world unto himself. So now the whole world has now been reconciled, therefore rendering all men savable. But there still needs to be a personal reconciliation by faith, for only then is salvation applied to the individual. Now, the blood of Messiah, the fifth thing was, it was the price that had to be paid for the penalty of sin. And we see this in Matthew 20, verse 28, and 1 Timothy 2, verse 6. 1 Timothy 2, 6, Matthew 20, verse 28. Now, in early church history, and not so early actually, because I heard a pastor say this once too. In early church history, some misunderstood the concept of ransom in the death of Jesus. And they actually taught that the ransom was paid to Satan. The Bible teaches that his death was a ransom, yes, but it does not say that the ransom was paid to Satan. On the contrary, God owed Satan nothing. Rather, the ransom was paid to the holy law of God. It was to the law that men were bound. The demands of a righteous law given by God had to be righteously and justly met. and Jesus's death did that. It met that. So the blood and the death of the Messiah is a ransom paid to the holy law of God. And again, those two passages, you can see that is Matthew 20, verse 28, and 1 Timothy 2, verse 6. Now his death, sixth thing, his death was proof of the love of God. And it's clear from scripture that God loves sinners, even in their unbelieving, sinful state. Otherwise, you and I would not be here. And the evidence of God's love for sinners is the death of Jesus, in that he died for the world in its sinful state, not in its redeemed state. And in John 3:16, it teaches that God loved the cosmos. He loved the world, the unbelieving world system that is contrary to him. And this is also affirmed in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, and 1 John 4, verse 9. 1 John 3:16, 1 John 4:9. Romans 5:8 clearly emphasizes that he died for men long before they became believers. Romans 5:8 says, in that while we were yet sinners, Messiah died, Christ died for us. So we were sinners and Christ died for us. The seventh result, it meant now the judgment of the sin nature. The sin nature is now co-crucified. We find this in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 to 10. The sin nature, remember, the sin nature is not removed when one believes. It is judged and condemned. It is destined to be obliterated either through the believer's death or at the rapture when the believer is perfected. Now, because of the sin nature, because the sin nature has been judged by the death of the Messiah, there is no obligation to obey it whatsoever. If one sins by giving into his sin nature, it is because he chooses to, not because he has to. Human that we are, we will sin. But the point here is that the believer is not obligated to sin. We do not have to obey the old sin nature, which was co-crucified, which was judged and condemned. We have a choice. Now, the eighth thing, it marked the end of the Mosaic law for the Jew. It's now rendered inoperative, and so Jewish believers are no longer under the law of Moses, but with the Gentiles are now under a new law, which is the law of Messiah. And this is the law of Moses has come to an end as a result of the death of Messiah. And we can find passages like Romans chapter 7, verses 5 to 6, Romans 10:4, Colossians 2:14, Ephesians 2:11 to 3:6, Hebrews 7:11 to 19, and 8:13, Galatians 3:17 to 19. They're all there on the PowerPoint slide. Now, another result is it is at present, right now, it's the grounds for the continuous cleansing of the believer's sin committed since one believed. So this cleansing is only possible because of Messiah's death. According to 1 John 1:7 to 9, 1 John 1:7 to 9, not only did his death accomplish a redemption by which the believer has been redeemed from the penalty of sin, which is salvation forgiveness, it also continues to be the basis for the removal of sins committed since one believed, and that's family forgiveness. That is our daily walk sins. It's also the basis for the removal of pre-cross sins. Now, when Jesus died, this is the 10th result. When Jesus died, he not only died for the sins to be committed from then onwards, but also for all the sins of the world committed before his death. And in Hebrews 10, verses 1 to 4, it emphasizes there that animal blood was not sufficient to take away sins. Animal blood was able to cover the sin of the Old Testament saint, but it could not remove the sin. So the sins of the Old Testament saints were covered by animal blood, And when Messiah died, when Jesus died, he finally removed their sins because they're now placed upon him. Only his death could accomplish the removal of pre-cross sins. And we find that in Acts 17, verse 30, Acts 17:30, Romans 3, verse 25, Romans 3:25, Hebrews 9, verse 15, Hebrews 9:15, and Hebrews 10, verses 1 to 4. It's also the basis, the 11th result is the basis for the judgment of Satan and his demonic hosts at the great white throne judgment after the Messianic kingdom, after the 1,000 years. So the basis of this is the death of Christ. And we can find this in John chapter 12, verse 31, John 12:31, John 16:11, John 16:11, and Colossians 2, verses 14 to 15. Colossians 2, 14 to 15. The death of Messiah is also the reason that divine righteous judgment has been deferred. And we find this in Romans chapter 2, verses 4 to 5, Romans 2, 4 to 5, 1 Peter 3, verse 20, 1 Peter 3, 20, and 2 Peter 3, 9 and 15. Man's sin is such that God has every right to judge man immediately. However, judgment is being deferred because of the death of Jesus, so that man now has an extended opportunity to accept God's free grace. And Paul taught this in Romans 9, verse 22. So for the last almost 2,000 years, judgment has been deferred because of the death of Messiah, giving man the opportunity to turn to him in faith. It's also the grounds for peace, and this is peace between God and man, which we find in Romans 5, verse 1. Also peace between Jews and Gentiles, we find in Ephesians 2, 11 to 16, and Colossians 3, verse 11. And also it's peace in the universe, which we find in Colossians 1, verse 20. 14th result is now it's the basis of the national salvation of Israel. Someday all Israel will believe on him. And we get this from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 3, Deuteronomy 31 to 3, and Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, and Romans 11, verses 25 to 29. And this result of the death of the Messiah is also the precondition to his second coming. Number 15, the 15th result is it's the basis for the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Revelation chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. Revelation 5, 8 to 14 makes the point that the millennial kingdom could not be established apart from the death of Messiah. Now, summarizing what has been said about the death of Jesus will help us see the enormous theological implications of this event for you and I as believers. By dying on the cross, Jesus presented himself as the perfect sacrifice that satisfied the demands of God's justice upon sin. By dying on the cross, he paid the penalty for sin on behalf of man, and he appeased the wrath of a just God. In doing this, what did he do? He brought forgiveness and reconciled the world to God, making it savable. Through personal faith in this act of Jesus, this act of Messiah, man accepts his substitution as payment for sin. Now, what's the importance of Messiah's death? We can see it in 6 ways. First of all, the death of the Messiah is important because it fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. The Old Testament predicted the death in some detail in 2 key passages. In Psalm 22, verses 1 to 21, that described events that could only be true of a crucifixion. Yet stoning at that time was the mode of execution, not crucifixion. So this prophetic passage emphasized the how of Messiah's death. He would die by means of crucifixion. Now, Isaiah 52, verse 13 to Isaiah 53:12, Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, it gave many more additional details concerning the event, emphasizing the why of Messiah's death, particularly the substitutionary nature of his death, that he died in our place instead of us. Second, the importance of the death of Jesus can be seen in the fact that 1/3 of the content of the Gospels is devoted to describing it. And third, regarding the death of the Messiah, the incarnation was paramount. He could not die until he was born. It was by means of the incarnation that the second person of the Trinity became a man. Whereas the rest of humanity is born to live, this one was born to die. And we find this in Matthew 20, verse 28, Mark 10, verse 45, Hebrews 2, verse 9, and 14 to 16. In 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 4, this is the fourth result. In 1 Corinthians, significance. In 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 4, Paul spelled out precisely the content of the gospel. And he listed 3 things a person must believe to be saved. First, that Messiah died for our sins according to the scriptures. Second, that he was buried, which was the evidence of his death. And third, that he rose again on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Now, Paul clearly states that our salvation is based upon Jesus' sacrificial death, that he died for our sins. Now, the fifth result here, if Jesus had not died, there would have been no atonement or significance. There would have been no atonement. This is the 5th significance. And we find this in John 3, verses 14 to 15, and John 12, verse 24. Now, some assume that if Israel had accepted him as the Messiah, he would not have had to die. But quite the opposite. His death was inevitable. He had to die. Even if Israel had accepted him as the Messiah, he still would have had to die, though the circumstances of his death would have been different. If the Jewish people had proclaimed Jesus to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the Romans would have taken this as an act of rebellion against Rome. They would have arrested him, they would have tried him, and they would have crucified him, and he would have been buried. And after he rose on the 3rd day, he would then have destroyed the Roman Empire, and he would have set up his messianic kingdom rather than departing for a duration of time. And the 6th significance, the death of Jesus, is supremely important to heaven itself, because we see this in Luke 9, verses 30 to 31, and Revelation 5, verses 8 to 12. Not only were things on earth, such as the saints, purified by the death of the Messiah, but we find that things in heaven were also purified. And we can see this in Romans chapter 8, verses 21 to 23, and Hebrews 9, 11 to 12, and 23 to 24. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.